Hello, and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast. I'm so excited to introduce my guest today, Lisa Fitzpatrick, who is a pelvic and sexual health educator, a physiotherapist, and she's been working with women and women's issues for the last 30 years. Today, we deep dive into the topic of perimenopause and menopause, such an important topic that all women go through that's not spoken about enough. So we talk about why there can be a decrease in our libido, how to change that, how to work through that so that we can have a fulfilling sexual life. What's happening to our hormones, our progesterone, our estrogen, our testosterone, why sex can be painful sometimes and what to do about it, and why we might be getting more bladder infections. This is just full of information, and us as women need to be talking about these things and normalizing them more. This can be a beautiful stage where we learn and accept ourselves and our bodies, and the more that we understand, the easier this transition can be. So I hope that Lisa shed some light on this for all of us. I got so much information from this podcast. Please, if you're enjoying them, take a moment to give us a like, a share, and a subscribe. And I want to thank you so much for being here today. Enjoy. Hello, and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast, a place to explore possibility through mindfulness, movement, and self-discovery. Our intention is to deliver insight and inspiration while fostering conversations that are genuine, unfiltered, and deeply human. We hope you will enjoy today's episode. Hi, Lisa. Welcome to the Connected Community Podcast. I'm so excited to see you.
So exciting to be here, Nikki.
Yeah, I'm used to saying good morning, and it's morning there in Australia, but it's afternoon here for me. It's like 6 a.m. for you.
I'm coming to you from the future.
Yeah, exactly.
Predict your future from here.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about menopause and perimenopause. And I was looking back, I actually did a podcast about this 2 months ago, but the focus was on why we gain weight. And I think that there's so much more about menopause and perimenopause. And I feel like it's not a topic that's discussed enough. And the more I start talking with my friends about it, the more they say that it's not talked about enough. And there's so much about this topic that I feel like we could do probably 20 podcasts. But anyway, you are a pelvic and sexual health educator, a physiotherapist, an author, and a speaker. And this is your passion project is perimenopause and menopause. And so I'm curious what got you interested in this in the first place.
Yeah, look, it's first of all, I'm 52, so I'm right in the middle of my menopausal sort of period of time. And also, I just could not. I'm really, really struck at the number of patients I see in my clinic, my pelvic health clinic, who are experiencing a lot of distress because of the sexual changes that happen for them in peri and menopause. And these changes are not just identity changes, as we often, hear about menopause. They're very physical ones that create a lot of, distress for women. And I just can't tell you how many women I see every week who feel like they're very, very lonely in their journey of the sexual changes in particular, and how those changes are maybe impacting their relationship with their husband of 20 years, or their ability to actually feel confident to meet a new partner is also impacted. It's a really, really harrowing time from that intimate, personal point of view.
Yeah. That's why I think it's such a big topic, because there's hormonal things that are happening. Our body physically is like, it's looking different. Things are feeling different. Our energy levels change, our sleep changes, our skin changes, our sexual life changes, like everything changes. And then we might not feel like we have a community to talk about. And I'd love for this topic to be something that we can talk to our girlfriends about and be more transparent about, because I'm around the same age you are. And I've noticed that the shifts are not subtle. They come on fast, and they're pretty dramatic, and they almost have been like throwing me for a loop. And I've been also struggling with, like, how do I how do I deal with this? How do I, right now I'm in the process of going gray. Like that's one stage. Like there's all these different stages of it and it's uncomfortable. And so I'm curious, what are the things that most of the women are coming to you for? And specifically like the sexual piece of it that's even more taboo, where we don't talk about it, where we can be talking about it and should be talking about it.
Yeah, there's probably three main sexual issues that I see recurrent, very repetitively. The first one, which I probably see the most, is no libido, the lack of the loss of libido. So women who were previously quite highly charged and had quite high libidos will say, I just don't know what happened to me. I used to be, quite a sexual woman and I'm just not interested anymore. And it's distressing to me because it formed such a big part of my identity. Yeah. The second one is recurrent bladder infections and other sort of issues with the bladder that possibly make women a lot more self-conscious about their about intimacy. And the third one is definitely the physical change to the tissue vaginally that actually creates a bit of discomfort with intercourse. And that can be incredibly distressing if a woman has basically maybe not had sex for a few months. It doesn't take long. Like you said, the changes are very fast. And so a woman might not have sex for 6 months. And by the time she goes back to have sex, even with the same partner, it might not feel the same. It might feel uncomfortable. She's like, what the hell happened to me?
Yeah. Yeah. So what is actually happening?
Yes, yes. So what happens is as our body's estrogen networks start to wind up, we actually experience a degree of estrogen withdrawal. And I don't think it's talked about enough that it's almost like we have to withdraw from a drug that has given our tissue collagen and resilience, and it's also given us our energy. And so, with the estrogen changes, the tissue, vulval tissue, vaginal tissue, becomes a little more vulnerable to stress and discomfort. It thins, it maybe shrinks slightly, that tissue. And also with the loss of estrogen, we lose some of our drivers that might have given us a bit of a spark. So estrogen comes from a Latin word, estros, which meant gadfly, which is kind of like a hummingbird or a fly that buzzes around. And when we're young, we buzz around and we've got all this energy. And then as the estrogen tapers down, we're less charged and we're meant to become more graceful and more efficient and a little more, slow in our movements because hopefully we're wiser. So, a wise woman moves slowly because we're moving at the pace of, I believe, I'll just throw this in there. I believe we're meant to slow down to move closer to the pace of divinity, which is a very
Mm.
slow, graceful way of moving. And so our bodies actually reflect the need for sex to slow down, to be a little more nurturing and comforting, to feel safer to the tissues that have lost their resilience, to build libido back with foreplay. And, it can be a really wonderful thing for a woman to change the way she has sex so that she can feel as though she's exploring a new side to herself and her relationships that maybe weren't really visited as much in the hard and fast years of, sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so let's talk about some of those things that we can change because it's so dramatic and drastic and it changes so quickly. It probably throws both partners into kind of like a loop of not knowing where to go and what to do, and things need to shift and change. And so, what are some graceful ways to move through that and make it more easeful and make it like a smoother transition?
Yeah, look, I think from a physical point of view, it's always a great idea to have a pelvic floor check. So to have a physical checkup with either your medical physician or your pelvic, we call them pelvic floor physios in Australia, someone who can sort of assess, is the tissue changing enough for you to require some topical estrogen? Or nowadays, there's also some natural alternatives to putting estrogen topically to the vaginal tissue for comfort. And that's a very simple way that does have a big impact on the way the tissue feels for comfort. The second thing to always remember, which I think we don't remember in Australia enough anyway, is the importance of preparing for intercourse itself, penetrative sex. So the body requires at least 18 minutes of gentle foreplay to create engorgement, circulation, and support and lubrication to tissue so that we can be really prepared for perhaps the friction and the pressure of penetrative sex. Yeah.
That's super interesting to know that.
Yeah.
It probably helps to know that because then it takes the stress out of it because you're like, okay, it's going to come.
It's going to come. And I think what I really appreciate a lot is when women are bringing their partners into my clinic a lot more now than they would have in the past, because this awareness even is spreading to our men who absolutely will rise to the challenge if they've got the level of empathy that we require in our partners at this stage. And I think that's a really big one too, because menopause is a time for a lot of women to decide to divorce. It's a really high divorce rate time. And some of that boils down to our bodies just saying, look, I have been enduring a coercive, controlling situation or a toxic relationship for too long. My body no longer allows that to happen. It's a seismic day of reckoning for a lot of women in their relationships. But the good men, the ones that we want in our world to really keep working towards greater intimacy, because, you know, I guess the theory is that biologically women only lived until they were 55 in those, you know, early days when we were kind of, you know, a bit more in our primitive state. And now we're living till 100. We have 45 years of estrogen that we need to keep in the tank to sort of help us stay you know, active and involved. And so adding some estrogen to our picture is also a really good strategy, and training our men that actually biologically, just because we can't procreate and have babies, it doesn't make us any less sexual. It doesn't make us any less interested in being sexual creatures. We just need to do it differently. And there's a lot of years where we can be exploring that. And I think the beautiful news about that is once women have crossed the menopause bridge skillfully, I see in my clinic these beautiful stories all the time of women in their 60s, their 70s, and their 80s having robust, healthy, fabulous sex. And they're just so happy that they worked through the concerns they had, because equally as heartbreaking are the women who come back and say in their 50s, I'm never going to have sex again because it hurts, or I'm devastated because I'm putting that part of my life to bed. And I think it's not necessary for us to have that grief. If we find it an important part of our life and our relationships, we can keep going and enjoying that once we get past this, I call it a 10-year bridge. You know, your perimenopausal, menopausal bridge it's about 10 years. It's not a short time.
Yes. I was just going to say that because I feel like perimenopause, people think of it as like a short thing, and then you go into menopause, and menopause is the cessation of the menstruation for a year. And so it does seem like perimenopause lasts a long time. So are you saying that that's the difficult piece, and once you cross over into menopause, things get easier?
Yes, in Chinese medicine, it's called the second spring. And it's where once the changes have been adapted to, because we're so adaptive as creatures, if we have the right support, if we have some topical estrogen and we understand about foreplay, and we work with the libido that we have to bring to, it's a bit like a bike. We need to stay on it in order to keep fueling some of those desires in our body, which are a very mental thing for women. We can find ourselves delivered, and I generally would say around about the post 55, between 55 and 60, a lot of women are starting to feel that it's a really beautiful leveling out, because there's no longer a hormonal fluctuation and cycle happening. There's a bit more sturdiness and steadiness in the mental sort of like hold on things. And I think that's really comforting to know once we're delivered, there's this
Yeah.
beautiful world on the other side.
Yeah. Yeah. So, for people that aren't familiar with what perimenopause looks like and the symptoms and the changes that are happening in the body, what can you say about that?
So perimenopause typically will start with a change in your menstrual cycle. That's a really big part of what will kind of start to indicate the change in your hormones. And that can look quite different depending on which woman we're looking at. Everybody has a different kind of hormonal profiling, and if we are under a lot of stress, what will happen is our bodies will release a lot of cortisol, and cortisol will be something that then distracts a hormone known as progesterone and makes that hormone very busy trying to manage cortisol. When progesterone's managing cortisol or stress, it cannot then be free to do its primary job, which is to regulate estrogen. And one of the biggest problems for women is dysregulation of estrogen in menopause, which then will either shorten their menstrual cycle, and sometimes sustained stress will even lengthen the menstrual cycle. So it will be very unpredictable when they'll actually have their bleed time. And then it can increase the flow of your menstrual cycle. So you might have had a very light period your whole life, and then suddenly it becomes incredibly heavy and painful. We can possibly develop structures in the uterus more. It's more common for us to develop structures like fibroids or polyps, which will actually increase our bleeding. And that's often an estrogen issue. So I think women in their 45 to 55 age bracket, just as a generalization, will often find themselves sandwiched between full-time work and raising kids and looking after elderly parents, or trying to manage this manic kind of world that we're in. And
Mhm.
actually, all estrogen wants from us and all our bodies want is for us to actually slow down, self-care, manage stress, breathe more deeply, do all the things that we're probably not doing
Right.
because of how our world is actually structured.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And then for me, I've noticed, okay, the graying hair, the weight gain, the insomnia. Let's talk about some of the other things.
Yes. The weight gain is a huge distress for women who also really felt a lot of identity from having good physicality and from being feeling sexual because they looked great. Yeah. And then
Hmm.
I hear these women saying, oh my gosh, in the last 12 months I've put on 10 kilograms, which
Oh my
is a
gosh.
lot of weight
22
for,
pounds.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
two dress sizes basically.
Yeah. Whoa.
And yeah, it's often not that. I don't think that part of the we talk about weight gain a lot in menopause, but
Hmm.
we often forget to mention how distressing that weight gain is for the intimacy side of life.
Yes.
The other thing about that is progesterone, when it's
Hmm.
so busy with cortisol managing stress that it can't manage our estrogen, there's not a lot of progesterone left over for us to then have a really good night's sleep. And if we don't have a good night's sleep, we're not cleaning the brain with a system which is known as the glymphatic system, which is only there cleaning the brain if we have a deep, deep sleep. And then we wake up hungry. We're a lot hungrier. Our appetite changes if we're not getting enough sleep. And there
Mm.
are some very good studies now that show that if we don't get enough sleep, not only are there ramifications for increased weight that can affect our health long term, with increased risks of diabetes and other things, but also a loss of sleep is one of the primary reasons why women are two-thirds more likely to develop dementia in old age. And
Wow.
they believe that the midlife sleep cycle, so between 40 and 60, if we don't get good sleep and we don't have those brain cleaning agents happening, we will absolutely start to get that brain fog, and that could potentially increase our risk of dementia. So, a good night's sleep is a cornerstone of managing a lot of things: weight, stress hormones,
Hmm.
progesterone, support for our, estrogen networks. And
Yeah.
my emphasis absolutely for a lot of my patients is to make sure we get a lot of attention to sleep hygiene.
Yeah. So, what is your advice for women that are experiencing all these changes and then they no longer feel sexy and then
Yes.
they no longer feel good in their body and it kind of works on their self esteem, their self image, how they project themselves into society?
Yeah, I believe that what the world needs is more role models around this very thing. So, one thing I will say is, as a personal practice, if we are very comfortable in our own intimacy with ourselves, so we're no longer distracting ourselves with the things of the world to try and ignore those changes and to try and sort of pretend that that's not happening until we get to crisis point. If
Mm.
we have a good practice of tuning into our own intimate bodies with either a self pleasure practice, which, so I'm a very big advocate for women to purchase a really good quality vibrator if they're comfortable with mechanics, or to at least continue to explore their bodies from a self pleasuring point of view, to understand how their particular bodies work in that way. I do encourage women to stay sexually active if they are in relationship, but that may often require a really good therapist for the couple to work through any major issues that might have occurred, and accumulated over the
Hmm.
course of a long-term relationship, if there's a monogamous relationship there. So I work very closely with a therapist. I send a lot of my patients to a therapist who can deal with pelvic trauma. So a lot of women have been storing the memory of trauma in their pelvic cauldron for many, many decades. And menopause is a time that brings a lot of that out. And
Mm.
intimacy there can be a barrier to intimacy if some of that unprocessed trauma doesn't get adequately addressed. And I think if we can have a good therapist, I'm a big believer that a good therapist trained in EMDR, which is an eye movement
Hmm.
therapy, can be a game changer for libido. I also work very closely with a sexologist who is able to really support couples in the cultivation of intimacy and arousal. So, yeah, there's the physical, there's the mental, there's the emotional, and then I also believe there's a deeply spiritual component to our sexuality as we go into menopause, because what happens with the sexual drive is it changes so that we're no longer procreative creatures. Procreative creatures are ones that can have babies and they tend to the tribe and they have this beautiful estrogen excess to look after all the babies.
Mm.
When we go into menopause and we no longer have the procreative urge, Sex is more about co-creation. It's more about us connecting deeply with our spirituality. So for a lot of women, that quiet, reflective time where again we're comfortable with our intimate self, we're
Mm-hmm.
comfortable with the peace and quiet that comes with sitting still and inwardly reflecting, that is incredibly, it's an incredibly beautiful way for a woman to strengthen her confidence in moving out into that world and perhaps being that role model that we don't see enough because so many older women are feeling like they're invisible. They don't feel their voices are important. They don't feel that they have a place to, vocalize a lot of these things that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And also, the hormone changes will often create a lot of anxiety for women. So, I also advocate for some form of hormonal replacement therapy if women are comfortable with that possibility. And it's really one of the beautiful things about modern medicine. I have always been a natural medicine advocate and I believe in that strongly also. But I also think that estrogen as a hormone replacement agent can be so powerful at supporting the bridge to be a little less hair raising in
Mm-hmm.
such a busy world. Yeah.
Yes, that's interesting. So, what are your thoughts on testosterone?
Yes. So testosterone absolutely has a place for a lot of women in supporting the libido increase. So
Mm-hmm.
if a woman's really struggling with libido, testosterone can often support the charge on that libido and the spark. What I want to say about testosterone, though, is that probably half my patients will say that they thought it would be a game changer, but
Mm-hmm.
because of the deeper issues at hand, which I believe include toxic relationships,
Yeah.
discomfort with self, some of the very deeply embedded traumatic stories of the pelvis, the testosterone is just a little like a band-aid on the top. And
Yeah.
for some women, it's not deep enough to give them what they really need.
Yeah. So, what would be a point where you would advocate testosterone for somebody?
Yes. I would say that for most women, it happens around about the midway point. So in Australia, most women will wind up their menstrual cycle by about the age of 51. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that time period is quite a good period to advocate for testosterone, because what it will do is it will help women to stay relatively interested in sex if they're really struggling with libido.
Mm-hmm.
It's very important for women to stay sexually active for the purposes of supporting healthy, resilient tissue vaginally. So what that testosterone will do at that particular time is it will at least keep that part of life, well, assist in keeping that part of
Mm-hmm.
life active, so that women don't get to that point where they're saying, oh my gosh, I haven't had sex with my husband for over a year. It's
Wow.
probably going to hurt because the vaginal tissue
Mm-hmm.
shrinks slightly and the vaginal canal length will shorten. There'll be some narrowing of the vaginal canal width as well. So that physical change is something that does need some work with either vibrator therapy or dilator therapy quite often for women in order to support comfort with penetrative sex.
Okay, so that's interesting. So that's the reason why you're saying to advocate for remaining sexually active, is that so that those systems kind of stay active and don't shrink
Yes,
and change.
yes,
Interesting.
absolutely.
Okay.
And
Yeah. Oh,
healthy
that's interesting.
tissue, in especially vaginally, the tissue is healthy when it's being exercised. So just like the structures and the skeletal, especially the skeletal and muscular systems, and we require gentle movement therapy for all other parts of our bodies, and the pelvic floor muscles are the same.
Yeah.
So if we're neglecting our pelvic floor exercises, we
Mm-hmm.
won't get that nourishing blood flow to the area, and that will then reduce and decline the tissue quality there, just as it would in any other part of the body. And so
Yeah.
when we remain sexually active, also the friction of penetrative intercourse and the muscle strengthening that happens with climax as well, that will
Mm-hmm.
improve the circulation to the tissue, and that will in turn then support the healthy resilience of that tissue.
Okay, interesting. So, what are your thoughts about yoni eggs?
Look, I've seen some damage done by from yoni eggs. So,
Interesting.
whilst I have a belief that they have their place and they need to be used very carefully, the misuse of a yoni egg can be quite catastrophic for the pelvic floor. So, I'm a big believer in being very well guided professionally with a yoni egg and skillfully with a yoni egg. So, yoni eggs,
How
the
how did
primary,
it
yes.
hurt?
Sorry, you go.
I'm just curious how it created destruction.
Yes. So I'll start with the good news about yoni eggs. The good news being that they are a wonderful way to keep the vaginal canal healthy if they're used as a relaxation agent. So they're used as something that's placed vaginally for the purpose of being used to having some gentle pressure in the vaginal canal, and also giving the tissue in the area a very gentle stretch. Yeah. I'm not a big advocate for women putting the yoni egg in place and then carrying on their day in an upright position, because what can happen is the muscles, the pelvic floor muscles can actually have so much demand that they overactivate for some women. So 30% of women are walking around with a very overactive pelvic floor. That's a very stressed pelvic floor. And that pelvic floor means that the muscles are holding that woman's stress as a default mechanism. Maybe she's incredibly athletic and she's put so much attention on core strength that she hasn't actually taught the muscles to relax and receive nourishment. And what the yoni egg can do is it can increase that tensile capacity even more if we're walking
Hmm.
around trying to hold a yoni egg in position. So for about 30% of women, that can be um, a great way to cause bladder issues, because overactive pelvic floors can sometimes mean we don't eliminate from the bladder or the bowel properly, actually. And for some women, then taking a yoni egg out when the tissues are very uh, they've activated around the egg. I've seen it twice now in the clinic where the force of pulling the egg out of the vaginal canal after it being in place has resulted in the vaginal walls actually collapsing into prolapse, which is quite a
Whoa.
common condition, but it's not something we want to increase our risk of by any means. We really want to reduce our risk of prolapse as we get into this low estrogen state.
That's really interesting, all of that, because I don't think people know that about yoni eggs. I don't think that that's a
It's not
lot
talked about
of
enough.
education around that is out there.
Yes,
Interesting. So it can be useful or harmful, and it's really good to work with a professional to figure out if it's right for you.
correct. Yes, there's so many great
Yeah.
devices out there that will give you indications around whether you're an overactive pelvic floor activator, or whether perhaps those muscles are in a low tone state and need a little bit more sharpening up. And we're all different. And some of us sit in the category of normal, where tone is, or muscle at rest is, poised. It's got a little bit of activity, but not so much that it's overactivated. And where we sit in that pendulum is very, very individual. So those of us that have practiced a lot of yoga, sometimes we can make the mistake of actually overactivating what's known in yoga as mula bandha, which is the
Mm-hmm.
root lock or the abdominal plus pelvic floor action. But some of us have learned really skillfully to tether our diaphragmatic breath to the pelvic floor so that we improve the beautiful pendulum of movement that can go from not only being strong, but also being flexible as well.
Interesting. Okay. And so, what is the reason that there's an increase in bladder infections?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So one is that women are notoriously bad at hydrating. So plain hydration is a really important thing to flush bladder, urinary tract tissue to stop, organisms, pathologies from developing and taking advantage of that environment. Secondly, in the vulnerability of the tissue thinning process, so as tissue reduces in estrogen, vaginal tissue can become quite thin, and it can actually increase the likelihood that opportunistic bacteria and bugs will take advantage of that vulnerability in the tissue. And thirdly, my big one, which I think a lot of people don't put enough attention on, is the increase in bladder irritants that we have in our modern world. So bladder irritants are things like, the 4 C's. So the 4 C's are caffeine, carbonated beverages, anything with bubbles, citrus, so strong citrus, and cocktails or alcohol can change the urinary tract environment enough to irritate bladders. And so that kind of chronic cystitis that women get in menopause is often the bladder finally saying, and the urinary tract finally saying, these things are too stimulating. These things are actually irritating tissue to cause what feels like a bladder infection, but is actually just a low-grade irritability in the tissue. And we want to really support the microbiome, I guess, to be really comfortable with these changes. So a lot of it does also come down to our gut microbiome, reflecting the vaginal microbiome. As our uterus and ovaries wind up estrogen production, our liver has to take on a much bigger role of breaking down some of the things that we might have once upon a time found really easy to digest. And then if we're not careful, the gut microbiome will really struggle with certain things that maybe when we were younger we could tolerate really well. But now that our liver's got so much of this work to do, it's struggling with that. So the microbiome in the gut will change. That will change the vaginal microbiome, and that will then possibly irritate the urinary tract. So there's also that factor as well.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. I remember on the other podcast, the lady was saying that our body, our metabolism changes, but also there's things that we did that we were younger that we would get away with. And so we would, eat crappy for a week, or we would have fatty foods or whatever. And as we're getting older, it's just that our bodies aren't as forgiving to those changes. And
Yes.
so what I've noticed is that I've had to go back to really healthy eating habits
Yes.
because the mistakes I would make or my body doesn't forgive me at all anymore for those.
So true. I think you're so not alone in feeling that, and that is real. And I think that's also something really quite exciting about menopause, in that we're forced almost to create these lifestyle changes that we were once really able to get away with, but there's no more excuses in a way. And what I like about that is that women start to finally, after all these years of martyring themselves to everybody else's needs, they finally say, actually, I need to pick me because this is a matter of, it feels like life or death for some women. If I don't do this, I'm sending myself to an early grave, and that's called cooking the golden goose. The golden
Mm-hmm.
goose that's looked after everyone and laid all the eggs. She has to be ascended to the queen, where she is able to possibly instruct others to do the work of the testosterone and estrogen. And hopefully, in her wisdom, she knows how to outsource things so that self-care is a priority.
Yeah. And it sounds like there's a big process of learning to honor the slowing down versus fighting it and pushing it away, because it's where our body's wanting to go and it's inevitable and it's the natural progression. And so instead of fighting it, that maybe we need more sleep, or maybe we need to take it a little bit easier in the gym or change our diet, add more protein, whatever, it's what we're needing to do. It's the path that is necessary to feel good.
Yeah, we can't just pop our hormone replacement therapy patches on and hope for the best.
Right, right.
Unfortunately, those things won't build bone density for us at the gym and muscle bulk. And yeah, it's fascinating to think that it's an opportunity for reinvention. So it feels like a collapse of all of our identities that we've associated with. And if we're not careful, we listen to everybody else's bidding and we think, oh my gosh, I'm failing, I'm failing, I'm failing. But if we look at the fact that this is our opportunity to let go of what everyone else thinks, really tune into what nature and divinity want at this time for us as women, we have a real opportunity for ascension. And, we have an opportunity to kind of really grow into our power and particularly our spiritual power. And I think that it becomes a very exciting thing for women to understand that this is an opportunity for you to be more powerful, not less powerful.
Yeah, I think that's key. But for people that can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, how do you guide them towards that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm so glad you asked that question because honestly, after going through a intensely heartbreaking relationship breakdown a year ago in my year of menopause and thinking I would never ever see the light, this is actually one of my specialties. Is supporting women to see that there is light,
Yeah.
because what I think women need to hear about this is that, yes, you have been through trauma in your life. You have experienced a lot of pain and heartache and trauma. And for some women, this is the end of the line. This is like a time for a lot of women to really, unfortunately, the rates of unaliving, suiciding, sorry to say that word,
Yeah.
is higher in this age group for a reason, because
Yeah.
women think that there is no hope of getting through this dark time. And what I'd like to say to that is there is such a thing as post-traumatic growth factor. So post-traumatic growth factor is not spoken about enough, that yes, you probably do have post-traumatic stress disorder from the way maybe you were treated in a toxic relationship, or you went through trauma when you were having your babies, or you went through trauma as a teenager that's only just surfacing now, or you had
Hmm.
childhood sexual trauma of some sort. Yeah. And these things are real and they are surfacing at this time more than any other time for a lot of women. But post traumatic growth is where we bounce back from the trauma even stronger and even more um, in touch with our life purpose than we ever were before the trauma even happened. And so the trauma becomes a catalyst for us to actually be delivered into a growth period where we are stronger than we ever were. Now, for someone struggling right now, it might be impossible for you to see that. But if you can
Hmm.
just hear that when this dark night passes, with your own prioritization of your self-care, the support that you maybe need to reach out for that you never thought you'd ever need. We need to swallow our pride as women. I don't think I've ever been more humiliated than having to reach out to everyone I knew to say, I'm not okay, I need help. Um,
Yeah.
then there is this period that we start to find ourselves in where we're recovering from it. But not only are we recovering, but we're coming back stronger than we ever could have been before. And I really think that's something women need to hear. Post-traumatic growth is very real. It's something that is so potent about being human, that we have this resilience internally that sometimes we have to get right to the bottom of the mine shaft to find the gold, to bring it back from that dark night. But if we hadn't gone that dark or deep, we would never have been able to ascend so high. So as a way of us thinking about this as an evolutionary capacity for women in particular, that is where our spiritual power actually comes from, is being able to traverse some of the deepest, darkest parts of our psyche that we may
Yeah.
not have addressed adequately, that we can then bring back to support our fellow humans, on their journey to healing in some way, even if it's just by living life by example. If you're an artist or someone who's not necessarily in a service-based position, but you're reflecting that journey through your work, and you're an example of a role model for others who has actually been able to hold that power, and really insist actually on that part of the heroine's journey, which is refusing to bow down to a patriarchal construct that says, oh, you just need to keep being productive, woman.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. That
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
not, we have to rebel against that. The rebellion
Yeah.
comes from you lying on the couch doing nothing. Think of how hard that is. That's a political act of defiance against the patriarchy.
Yeah.
That is, yeah. But it's
Yeah.
it's a wonderful act. Anyone who's listening right now, please do yourself a 10-minute lie down on the couch kind of moment and look at how hard it is for you to stop and
Yeah.
realize this is your act of matriarchal defiance.
Yeah. Yeah. It is hard. It is hard when we're conditioned so much. Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Well, Lisa, how can people connect with you? Let's talk about some of your offerings, and then also you have a book coming out. So I would love for you to share about yourself and what you're up to.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, so people can find me at www.sexymenopause.com. On that site, if you subscribe to my newsletter, where I do keep you up to date with a lot of fabulous information about pelvic and sexual health in midlife, as well as other feminine power strategies, there is a free freebie that comes with the subscription called 10 Truths Every Woman Needs to Know About Sex After 50. And also, is it an estrogen issue, which is a little checklist that you can go through to say, hey, how much of this is estrogen? Do I need to look at whether
Oh,
estrogen is
yeah.
something I could supplement with? They can also find me at the Lisa Fitzpatrick on Instagram, where I keep you up to date with what I'm up to in terms of that feminine power journey. And yeah, I'd love to say that my book is due for release in February 2026. It's called Sexy Menopause. I know that it's a controversial title for a reason, for all the ways that we spoke about today. And yeah, thank you so much, Nicky, for the great
Hmm.
conversation too.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great title, by the way.
Thank you.
Um, and yeah, thank you. I thank you for doing this work and for shedding this light. I think it's such an important topic. I think that a lot of times, especially, we don't talk about menopause, but then even deeper, we don't talk about the sexual part of it.
Yeah.
And it's so important that we're transparent and open as women and sharing and normalizing all the things that can and could potentially happen during this time. So thank you so much.
Absolute privilege and pleasure to come to you from the future.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Connected Community Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe. I can be found at www.nickyyoga.com, NICKYYYOGA.com. Until I see you again next week, I hope you have a beautiful day.